Hello again. In this lecture, I want to talk about a series of Eastern European poets and some intellectuals as well in the way that they think about evil as a complement to what we've been talking about more theoretically with the work of Hannah Arendt and other philosophers and theologians. Now, if the master genre of literary thinking about evil in the century or so leading up to World War II was the novel, you think about figures like Dostoevsky or Conrad, even a post-war figure like Camus, who has in some ways more to do with pre-war conceptions of how to think about evil. After World War II, the genre of the novel seems to be harder to sustain as a theoretical device, a generic device to think about evil in. Novels capture large narrative forms, and they offer large kind of epic scopes for thinking about evil. A novel can make sense of a large social scene in that way. But since World War II, novels have seemed not as successful in capturing the human experience of evil. Instead, other genres, memoir, essay, and especially the genre of lyric poetry, have seemed more potent and offered more profound explorations of evil. But such genres as these face two fundamental problems that really complicate their success. One is an aesthetic problem, an aesthetic challenge, and one is a kind of more generic challenge about whether or not we can hear the truth they need to convey. Let me say something about both. First, aesthetically. All poetry is haunted after World War II with the thought that it is somehow quite radically not just inadequate, but actually improper to be writing poetry in the wake of these events. As the German thinker Theodor Adorno put it, a Marxist who had fled Nazi Germany, it may seem to us that to write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric. That's his famous line. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. It's translated different ways. And since World War II, in fact, there seems increasingly less and less confidence among many artists and intellectuals in general that beauty is something to be sought, that it's anything more than an escape from reality, a consolation for the true ugliness of reality. You may think I'm making, too much of a few intellectuals, but I don't think I am. There are, in fact, powerful forces at work in our intellectual culture, urging everybody to generate a kind of sheer ironic distance from all potential sources of inspiration in the world. And among those sources of inspiration, beauty is high on the list. Given that poetry is so much about beauty, poetry especially feels this challenge in profound ways. Secondly, there's a second problem about the problem of representation itself. We saw some of this in Conrad. How can you actually tell the truth about what has happened? It seems at times that the realities can dwarf the human's imagination, its capacities to represent what has happened, to comprehend the full magnitude of it. And in some ways here, irony is not the enemy. Irony may be in some ways the ally. Consider the case of Primo Levi. He's a brilliant Italian chemist, and after the war, a thinker and writer, who was also a survivor of Auschwitz. Here is the very first sentence of his memoir of survival from Auschwitz. In the American edition, it was translated Survival in Auschwitz, which sounds like a how-to guide, but in the original Italian and then in England, when it was translated into English in England, it was If This Be a Man, because that's his question is this human nature? This is the very first sentence. It was my good fortune to be deported to Auschwitz only in 1944. That is, after the German government had decided, owing to the growing scarcity of labor, to lengthen the average lifespan of the prisoners destined for elimination. It conceded noticeable improvements in the camp routine and temporarily suspended killings at the whim of individuals. Just think about that sentence. Think about how it starts out. Unbelievable. It was my good fortune to be deported to Auschwitz in 1944. I mean, imagine the kind of irony of a sentence like that. And then step back from it and imagine even more shockingly that Levi, in the rest of the sentence, unpacks how it's not ironic, how it's not sarcastic, how in fact the reality goes beyond irony. because it was literally his good fortune that he was only sent to Auschwitz in 1944. When you see that, when you appreciate the magnitude of the irony in reality in a situation like that, you realize that irony is not only an optional source for thinking, it has to be concretely employed, because reality is ironic already for us. So this tension between suspicion of beauty and an endorsement of irony, and yet irony's corrosive effects on real beauty, this is a tension that all these artists, these poets, and these thinkers have to struggle with. In this lecture, I want to look at three poets in particular who try to think about what it means to experience evil in the 20th century, and then what it means to try to resist it. First of all, Paul Celan, a survivor of the Shoah. Secondly, Czesław Miłosz. And thirdly, Zbigniew Herbert. Miłosz and Herbert are both Polish poets who were in the Polish resistance, though they did never end up in death camps. Let's start with Celan. Celan lived from 1920 to 1970, and he was a Romanian Jew who was picked up and sent to the death camps. He survived the Shoah, though his parents, who he deeply loved, did not. Eventually, after the war, he moved to Paris, where he lived, growing increasingly known for his poetry. And yet, over time, his post-war life, his survival of the death camps, became unendurable to him. And in 1970, he killed himself. Now, as we saw, there is this famous line, to write poetry after Auschwitz is audacious enough, is barbaric, some people say. But what about writing poetry about Auschwitz? What about writing poetry about the death camps directly? And what about writing that poetry about the death camps in German? That's running straight into the wind. But that's just what Celan does. And he makes his case well. The deep point of poetry is getting at the deep truth of things. And if the deep truth is of evil and suffering, and is of evil and suffering in the voice of those who caused the evil and suffering, as well as those who suffered it, even if the irony is too great for human minds to bear, and Celan excelled at offering a language in which irony could become too great for the human mind to bear, still he thought it must be spoken. Perhaps the most powerful, but still under-recognized, under-attended to, poetic representation of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, is Celan's own poem, Todesfuge, or Death Fugue, which recounts one person's experience of the Holocaust, if you can call it that, although there's never an I in the poem, it's always a we. This poem is unbelievably powerful, and I would encourage everyone to try to read it. It's no more than a page or so, but it's visionary in its summary of the experience of the Holocaust. A couple of elements in the poem are especially important, both for thinking about poetry and for thinking about Celan's approach to poetry. First of all, the poem starts with a couple very, very strange lines. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening. We drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night. The collapse of the sequential character of human experience in the death camps is brought right to the fore there, right? How do we drink? First of all, bracketing the question of what the black milk of daybreak is, we drink this milk at evening, and then at midday, and then at morning, and then we drink it at night. For the inmates of these camps, as for the damned in Dante, there is no time anymore. There's no narrative structure to anything, just the endless, deadly, cyclical round of every day. And eventually, even the pieces of those days break apart. Remember, this is a fugue. It's a death fugue. A fugue is a musical piece that repeats itself cyclically in complicated ways before coming together in a resolution at the end. His fugue breaks apart at the end. As the poem comes to whatever conclusion it can manage, these words keep repeating, but the final stanza itself is composed almost entirely of fragments of earlier lines of the poem, but now enjammed together in ways that bear an ominousness, but seem to resist communicating any coherent message. In a way, Celan is suggesting, the experience of the camp is outside of time. It's outside of history. And the collapse of narrative structure that the poem represents, the poem gives to you if you try to read it, it's not only beyond time in a way, but by being beyond time, by being beyond temporal structure by being beyond storytelling. It's beyond sense-making. It's beyond logic. And here as well, a fantastic story from Primo Levi's, If This Be a Man, can be quite pertinent. Levi at one point is, early in his time in Auschwitz, is doing something, and he sees some guards, I think, hurting somebody else for what seems no reason to him, and he wonders what's going on, and he asks them, "Warum? Why? Why is this happening?" And the guard turns to him and strikes him very hard and knocks Levi down. And the guard says, "Hier ist kein Warum." Here there is no why. In other words, here you don't get to ask these questions of why. For you, there is no reason for anything. Everything that happens because of causes far beyond your understanding. Do not attempt to understand. That phrase, hier ist kein Warum, here is no why, captures a certain kind of dimension of the death camps in a way that, for Levi and for those who survived them, is essential to their experience, if we can't use the word meaning. Secondly, about Celan's poem. In a complicated way, the inmates of the camp are implicated in the instruments of their own destruction, just because the poem itself is in German. Famously, this poem says, one of its lines, repeated several times, is, "Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland." That is, death is a master from Germany. And in the poem, the only named character is named Margareta and Shulamit. It's a non-Jewish name and then a Jewish name, a hybrid of German and Jew. The idea here seems to be that part of the trauma of this evil is that it is so deeply intimate to the inmate's own ordinary experience. There is some way that for Celan, it mattered very much that his poetry was written in German about the experience of what happened to a people who were German, but also not German, not allowed to be German, who were going to be exterminated precisely because of their difference from what their exterminator saw as true Germanness. Celan, that is, wants to think about how it is possible to go on being who you were before the death camps, if you were a German Jew, if you were from a family that spoke German. How it is possible to go on in some continuity from what happened before to what happens afterwards. The analogy here is famously at the end of Elie Wiesel's Night. At the end of Night, Wiesel, for the first time in years, he survived Auschwitz, for the first time in years, he looks at himself in the mirror and he sees a figure there that bears no resemblance to any understanding of himself. And that's the way that Night ends, if you have ever read the memoir Night. He says, "I looked into the eyes of someone entirely different from me, entirely strange to me." And that moment is intentional for Wiesel, in the same way that Celan's use of German is intentional. How do you connect who you are, who you thought you are, with who you have become, what has happened to you? What kind of continuity is available to people after these events? That's a profound question. Celan's use of German itself as a poetic language asks that question. But there's a terrible, stubborn, one can't say insistence, but a quiet pulse in Celan's writings. A pulse of something almost too weak to be called a minority report or a minor theme, but a faint, quavering sense of hope, even if the hope is in some sense superhuman. Now, to move from Celan to Czesław Miłosz is to move from someone who suffered from the Nazis as an inmate to someone who suffered from the Nazis as a subject and then also as a resistor in the Polish army. Miłosz was born in 1911 and he only died in 2004. He was actually a secret resistor during the war And then after the war, he was initially the cultural attaché for the new communist government, new communist Polish government, in their Paris embassy. But as the government became more and more under the thumb of the Soviet Union, he became less and less enamored of it. He defects in 1951. And in 1953, he publishes his book, The Captive Mind, one of the great moral works of the 20th century, of intellectual free thought in the 20th century, against his friends, his fellow intellectuals' his romance with communism and with communist ideology before the Second World War and then after the Second World War. He befriended Camus in Paris and became a kind of marginal figure on the French scene precisely because he was an anti-communist when most of the French intellectuals, with Camus as an exception, a few others, were not anti-communist. Camus and the others were anti-communist, but the others were mostly communist. He ended up emigrating to the US in 1960. He taught at the University of California in Berkeley from 61 to 98 when he retired and went back to Poland. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. In contrast to Celan, Miłosz's poetic voice developed before World War II and so was not forged in the crucible of that event, but it was profoundly shaped by it. But he never thought, in all of his poetry, even to the end, that it was impossible to ask direct questions about reality using plain and straightforward language. In a way, he always believed in language's power. He was troubled in this belief, but he believed in its power, not so much to represent reality as a whole, but rather to call our attention to facts and truths we would rather not recognize, or at least rather not admit to ourselves that we know. In poems like A Poem for the End of the World, or A Poor Christian Looks at the Ghetto, a poem he wrote about the Warsaw Ghetto in Warsaw in 1942, I believe, in the middle of World War II. In those poems, he speaks with a profound directness, although a philosophical depth, about what's going on in front of his eyes. He retained a complicated, combative, disputatious faith in the Roman Catholicism of his youth, though he was always tempted by darker interpretations of reality than mainstream Roman Catholicism allowed. Right? If von Balthasar is an optimistic Roman Catholic thinker, Miłosz, insofar as he is a Roman Catholic thinker, is in some ways the opposite. But nonetheless, in the end, he found in the image of the crucified Christ, in God dying on the cross, a powerful image through which to meditate on the mysteries of human providence, suffering, and iniquity in this world. One poem in particular he wrote, called A Poem for the End of the Century, written in 1991, has always, for me anyway, stuck with me as speaking of these themes with special clarity and intensity. As he says at the beginning of this poem, he writes it in a time of triumph when sin had vanished. And those of us who remember the immediate post-Cold War years, there was a sense, the famous book about the end of history, there was a sense that somehow maybe things might be getting better now. Maybe a certain kind of dramatic evil could not come back and haunt us again. Miłosz finds, though, that he is troubled by the idea that evil has been vanquished. He thinks that that belief is naive, but he suggests also that his belief is shameful, he says, shameful in this situation, but that he's compelled to think these thoughts and speak them, at least in the poem, by his own memories of suffering and death. Not just the sufferings and death of those he knew personally in his life, though he knew both suffering and death and was well acquainted with those who experienced both, but also with the suffering and death of Jesus Christ, a figure for Miłosz who was both temporal and eternal, suggesting both that the events of the 20th century were events of that century, but also spoke to something more profound, something more perennial. He says that at the heart of everything, perhaps, is a reality, and I'm quoting the poem here, of pain and also guilt. Given that, he says, can we really believe that evil has been forever overcome? Remember his old friendship with Camus. He ends the poem, interestingly, by saying that his concerns, his thoughts, the dark brooding that he undertakes, is not for people. And he says, the world now, after the end of the Cold War is genuinely blessed. Goodness is good in itself, even if not everyone can share in it, he seems to be saying. Even if some people's experience makes it impossible for them to appreciate it. Even if the people whose own experiences of evil, suffering, and horror are the experiences that make it possible for other people to have the blessedness and the happiness they have. Their experiences of suffering and evil cannot be considered to count against the blessings and the joy of the people who experience the fruits of their suffering. For Miłosz, that is, innocence is real, and it's a good thing. But innocence and experience coexist in the world, and there is no way, it seems, at least this poem suggests, no way, for experience to help innocence learn what it doesn't know. All it can do is wait to see what happens. So Miłosz helps us think about how we might be vexed in passing on the lessons gained by hard-won experience to those who do not have those experiences. And yet the experience is there, and in no way is Miłosz himself doubtful that it's true or important. In a way, the question is how that language that is not for people, how it can be made suitable for people. And the answer to that question is precisely the body of Miłosz's own poetry. For he wrote to show that language could at least be glimpsed, a language of real horror, real suffering, could be glimpsed and appreciated by those blessedly ignorant of those phenomena at first hand. Now, to turn from Miłosz to his countryman Zbigniew Herbert is to turn from someone with a romantic and philosophical expansiveness in his poetry to someone far more ironic, epigrammatic, and terse. Reading his poetry, reading Herbert's poetry, it feels as if these poems were really telegrams sent from some desperate city fighting off an almost insuperable army. And in fact, one of his greatest books and one of his greatest poems is entitled Report from the Besieged City. Now, Herbert was born in 1924 and he died in 1998. Like Miłosz, he was a veteran of the Polish resistance army against the Nazis, but unlike Miłosz, he spent most of the rest of his life in communist Poland, not as a supporter of the regime, but as a resistor and a dissident. Never a favorite of the communists, for a while he was actually completely suppressed and unpublished. At one point, he was reduced to having to donate his own blood to get a little money. For 6 months, that was the only work he could do, was donating pints of blood to get money. Nonetheless, he persevered in his writings and his convictions, and by the 1980s, his poetry was one of the main inspirations for the resistance movement Solidarity. In fact, his poem, The Envoy of Mr. Cogito, is considered by many Poles the anthem of Solidarity itself. Now, Herbert's poetry is profoundly curtailed, terse, each word carrying immense weight, but each one also standing stripped of some essential ease about its meaning, so that the sense of urgency from line to line in his poems is tremendous. As he says in The Envoy of Mr. Cogito, you have little time, you must give testimony. The sense of the need to get going on sharing these thoughts with people, and yet the obscurity of what the thoughts are that are to be shared is very important to him. His poetry completely lacks punctuation. There are no commas, no periods, no semicolons, none of that. This lack of punctuation increases their sense of desperate urgency, but also strips them of one aid for comprehending their full meaning. So that we have the experience in reading him of something momentous being pressed on us violently, but also vaguely, as if the poems seem to have suffered some kind of grammatical trauma. These poems have stumbled out of a terrible plane crash that they were lucky to keep their own skin from. And in general, the overall impression of Herbert's poetry is one of ironic truth-telling against tremendous odds, offering us, and this is, I think, his really important thing, offering us one powerful rhetoric by which to resist the attempt of the totalitarian state to lie to us constantly. For our purposes, probably his most directly relevant poem is one entitled The Power of Taste. In that poem, he says that resisting totalitarian regimes, as he did, quote, didn't require great character at all, unquote. It only required taste, he said. Taste, an aesthetic sense that the terrors of totalitarianism were pressed home in so ugly a form that they could be resisted. It was the ugliness of totalitarianism that someone with a proper sense of beauty could in fact resist. It's an interesting claim, right? That in some ways, in our ability to know what beauty is, we see some kind of stiffness, cartilage, not bone, not totally rigid, but some kind of structure of the conscience that helps us sustain our larger moral stance in the world. Knowing what beauty is connected, he thinks, to knowing what ethics is. Here the idea is that poetry and aesthetic work more generally is not simply one way that such evil may be described and then resisted. It is in fact, for Herbert, the consummate way to resist such evil. To fight against the fundamental utilitarian ugliness of totalitarianism just is to fight against its most profound instrument of darkness. And if that is true, then Herbert actually has a charge, a response to Adorno's charge. Adorno's charge that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. And his response is, no, no, no. It is not to write poetry after Auschwitz that is barbaric. That would be to refuse to attempt to recover something of the civilization and the humanity. Not that those two are the same things for Herbert. He's not that foolish. To recover something of civilization and humanity in the wake of these horrors. Now let's conclude on this. The visions of evil that these poets represent are diverse, but in each case, the experience of the subject before the challenge of evil is directly thematized and explored. For Celan, the problem was how to represent an evil that broke apart normal human experience itself. For Miłosz, the problem was how to attempt to communicate such untimely thoughts in a time of universal utopia and happiness. For Herbert, the challenge is to make plausible the idea that totalitarian evil's great vulnerability, one of its great vulnerabilities anyway, is precisely its ugliness, and that the work of poetry and of beauty just is the work of resisting those evils. Now, given those insights, what can we do? What about positive guidance? What advice or lessons did these poets have for us? Much of that depends on which one you ask, of course. Miłosz and Herbert in particular seem to point to the possibility that life in totalitarian societies outside of death camps can teach us some new insight into the nature of evil in our world. And in this, their lessons are fleshed out and unpacked a bit by their less poetic, but no less deep-thinking fellow intellectuals. People like Adam Michnik in Poland, Georgi Konrad in Hungary, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. These are the great leaders of the Eastern European resistance against totalitarianism. These thinkers diagnosed their situation in terms that oftentimes drew from and always resonated with these poets and thinkers like Arendt. They all saw the basic problem they faced as how to live an honest life when the whole world around you wants to live in a lie. As Havel put it, the power of ideology is the way it convinces people that reality is as the ideology, the totalitarian state, says it is. But it does through terror and the threat of terror, which eventually convinces all of us to live in this lie. For thinkers like Havel, and Konrad, and Michnik, we must instead live in the truth. And this will eventuate in a certain kind of rival life against the totalitarian state, the creation of cells of resistance within this state. This rival community survives not by a mass movement, not by any kind of large-scale structures or by sheer force, but rather by expressing and sharing a certain quality of truth-telling. This truth-telling couldn't be denied or annihilated, not exactly by ideology. All it could try to do was compel us not to believe in it. But if it were denied, as by the authorities, it was so often denied. Still, even in the effort to deny it, the truth called attention to itself, and some people would notice. That was why, amidst all the sordidness of the 20th century, the world was so blessed to have a number of these resistance movements. that finally we're able to show the crucial weakness of totalitarianism and its crucial vulnerability simply to the sheer fact of telling the truth. Now, in the next lecture, I do want to move to another genre, another approach altogether. I want to think now not so much about poets and writers and intellectuals and artists, but now about a series of scientists and their own recent troubling discoveries about our propensities towards something that looks a lot like evil.